I don't know exactly when I first met Mako Fujimura, but it was sometime in the late 1990s when I was a pastor in New York City. Mako participated in a series of faith and culture events I organized at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. That's when I began to take in that this is one unique and gifted artist and a follower of Christ. He's done so many amazing things with his life. I'm going to let the program notes cover those, but let you know that if you want to find out more, one place to go is IAM Culture Care, which relates to his movement, the International Arts Movement, and you can find that on IAM Culture Care on the web. So Mako and our lives have intersected intermittently in the past 2 decades since I left New York City, though certainly less regularly than I would like. I did hear an interview just recently with Mako and our mutual friend, Mark Laberton, about his book, Art and Faith, A Theology of Making. And I said, it's time to reconnect. So I messaged Mako to set up this interview on beauty, art, justice, and science. And we'll see about how many of those topics we can cover today. So Mako, it is so good to talk with you.
Oh, it's so great to see you, and after so many years. And I think last time we saw each other was in Pasadena, and it was raining. So
yeah, unusually raining in Pasadena. Right? Well, let's just go right to that moment, because that was the last time I think we interacted in person. And you know, it was a rainy day. I knew that you had been you were in charge of heading up the Brehm Center at Fuller Theological Seminary, and I walked in and I said, is Mako around? And you were around, and you showed me the painting that you were working on. And you said, Greg, one thing, you could take a picture of this, but you're not going to be able to capture what the materials do. Yeah. So do you happen to remember what the piece was you were working on at that time?
I must have been working on the silence pieces at the time when I began the Brehm Center, duties. And I just left that about a year and a half ago. But I was also writing a book called Silence and Beauty, based on Shusaku Endo's novel Silence and Martin Scorsese's film Silence. And so I did a series of paintings of that theme, and it was particularly using the materials that is so difficult to capture in a photograph, especially in a digital photo realm. So I made a point to mention that to people, because people like to take photos with their iPhone, and it's this deep green blue painting that becomes completely gray when you try to take a photo of it, and people are like, what? Well, it's refractive, so that's why.
Yeah, I'm sorry to remember what you were saying, but I think one of the things about your work, I mean, I'm going to run out of superlatives today, so I'm just going to, that's a warning for this interview. But what is extraordinary about it is the amount of attention you put into the materials that go into your work. Mm-hmm. So yes. I think I first got to know your work. It was in the tradition of Nihonga painting. Is that correct? Where you use particularly
I continue to use Nihonga materials. In fact, sitting behind me are 2 monumental paintings called Walking on Water, which is done in response to 311 and beyond, the cries of the earth, cries of our hearts paintings. And they are done with azurite, pulverized azurite, which is the same material that artists used in 17th century Japan.
Wow. And so 311 was the nuclear
yes, the disaster, the tsunami and earthquake and the nuclear disaster, which the meltdown, which still is continuing, by the way, in Fukushima, Japan.
Yeah. Yes. Wow. Well, I mean, I didn't even know about the piece. I was going to ask you about it. So can you say maybe a little bit more about what's behind you? You said it's Walking on Water, right?
Right. And this was a ongoing collaboration as well with a composer friend of mine, Susie Ibarra, who's a TED scholar, and she has been collaborating with me since early 2000s. And we have been thinking a lot about the gaps between what we do as as artists, but also where society has seemed to veer away from caring for culture and our world, and culture is culture wars, and so how do you create in the midst of that? And so we began to Susie went to the Himalayan mountains with this grant to and she brought underwater microphone to record the melting glaciers, and came back with this just remarkable recordings, and she said, I'm going to compose music using the sound, and which is part of what she does. And I said, well, I happen to be working on a series called Walking Water. These are very large, 12 feet by 7 feet paintings. And so, she came to look at one of the paintings, and then she said, well, I want to compose in response to your piece, a series of compositions. So we got a grant for that, and we made that happen, and it just came out in a vinyl form.
Wow.
Innova Records produced it, and so it's an ongoing meditation on what was happening in response to natural disaster, but now it's another natural disaster,
Right.
COVID pandemic. And so I think the music, both the music and the art, reflects that as well.
Yeah. Well, and the issue of global climate change is really important to Science for the Church, which I co-direct, and we do outreach with that. So you're speaking to what's in my heart, and I think we both have a concern for generations that are younger than us. And of course, global climate change is a huge burden. I would just say that I teach a course also at Chico State University on End of the World. And one of the scenarios that resonates with students, in addition to religious views of that, transhumanist views, shall we say, is the climate change apocalypse that's happening. And I can just tell you that that's a very close, the problem of climate change is very close to my students and what concerns them. Yeah,
especially where you are with wildfires and so forth. It's very immediate. And, with these pieces, they do reflect some of the traumas that I went through with 9/11, because I was a ground zero resident and raised my children there 10 years after we moved out to Princeton. That's where I am now. But these works do reflect traumas. The question that my art asks is, can we walk on water? Which is an impossible question. There's no answer to that, but I believe art can enlarge the question and make it deeply meaningful for those of us who are going through trauma, and even in this presumed post-pandemic world, we are not the same, and we need to recognize both the pain and the suffering, not just for us, our sakes, but for the world. And I think connections with trauma of nature and trauma that we carry are connected.
Right. Well, and I think what this important concept that you carry forward of culture care is significant here. And I know partly I will just say a lot of what I'm going to ask assumes somebody will also listen to the interview with Mark Labberton, which was so profound and doesn't need to be repeated, but I'd love to build on what you all talked about, you both talked about. And culture care is so important. And I love the way that, culture care is important for us, again, with Science for the Church, because we see science and faith often said as alternatives, or actually not as alternatives, opposing sides in the culture wars, right? So we're trying to bring those together. And you were mentioning in the interview with Mark that we see what's happened with culture wars. We saw it on January 6th with the riots at the Capitol.
Yeah.
And you're seeking to do some healing with your work. So can you say a little bit about culture care and what that means?
Yes. And culture care is the nonviolent resistance to culture wars. And,
yes, yeah.
It is to change the metaphor from culture as a battleground, which is very toxic to everyone, to culture as an ecosystem, culture as a garden to steward. So even if you have disagreements or if you think differently, if you're raising a tomato here in New Jersey, you want to learn from the best, right? And the way to learn that is by tasting the tomato first, and what kind of fruit are we producing? And that's how it starts. If you're at a farmer's market, you don't ask, is this person a Presbyterian? Is this person a liberal Democrat? No, you ask, is this tomato good?
Right.
And we should treat all things that way, in my opinion, and value what we make, rather than argue over the recipe of what we think we ought to believe. But it comes out obviously of our culture, which is polarized and divisive, and we made our culture into culture wars. That's the only way, and particularly for the church, the problem is, the church is seen as the birthplace of culture wars. Right. So if you look at Galatians 5, the New Testament epistle of Paul to the letter church in Galatia, and go through all that Paul describes as a fruit of the Spirit, fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, and self-control. And we talk a lot about this in an individualistic way in the church. And if we ask ourselves, how have we done? Are we seen as people of love? Are we seen as people of peace? Are we seen as people of joy? The answer is no. I mean, the world doesn't see us. In fact, if you read back to the previous sentence that Paul writes about the fruit of the flesh, it seems to describe the church very well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And Mako, one of the things that's so interesting for me as a university lecturer is to read essays about Christianity from people who generally are out of the side of the church, but even inside, and what they think of us as Christians. And I will just tell you that that's exactly the kind of thing I read, judgmental, divisive, and you can walk down that road.
It's kind of the opposite of the fruit that we have worked so hard actually to promote in our church, within the church culture. So what happened? What failed? And in fact, this relates to creation care as well, because in US, especially, when you talk about the environment in any kind of fashion, it's thrown into the culture wars rhetoric right away.
Right.
And that's why it doesn't get anywhere. And in a lot of cases, you have to go underneath the radar, or, rely on younger people to speak the values that we our generation holds. As we are very, suspicious of anything that, and because it's already polarized language.
Right.
So when you talk about the environment, it's like Greenpeace, that's the image you have.
Right.
So what do you do? Well, you need culture care to mend the language first of how we view culture at large, and how do we talk about fractures in culture. And rather than pointing fingers and saying, well, that's the left, it's trying to gain power or whatever, or the right fighting for the ideological lockdowns. We can again go back to the fruit of labor. Like if you care about wildfires and what kind of wine are we talking about, right? The grape has to be tended to, taken care of for generations, in fact.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to go off camera here for a second, because I wasn't going to put this in there, but there's a great quote I have from one of your favorite writers, T.S. Eliot.
Yes.
From the Four Quartets.
Yes.
Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden. Under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still.
Yeah.
I read that in preparation for our time today, and I didn't suspect it was going to come in, but when you talked about words, how they strain and they crack. I love the way Eliot, as a wordsmith, knew that. And
we are distracted from distraction by distraction.
Right.
Yeah. In this twittering world. I love it. Invented Twitter a long time ago.
Oh, Mako, I feel like I am a jazz artist, so I'm gonna do a little jazz. I've got pieces that I'm bringing in, and it's so much fun. So I want to get to Kansugi, if that's okay, to move to Kansugi art.
Yes.
And you can give me the proper pronunciation, but
Kansugi is right. Yeah,
I'm on the right track. Good. Okay, so here's a little chalice that was made by the monks of Taizé.
Yeah.
We got it, Laura and I, my wife and I, when we were on sabbatical, and we've been using it for the past months when we've been worshiping. We've been worshiping at National Cathedral, and we do Eucharist during the service. So one day, Laura was. Let's just say one of us. I'm sorry, I spilled the beans. Laura did it. She knocked this off, cracked it here. And it actually cracked all the way down.
Yes.
And so I am of a generation. My parents were born in the Depression. Nothing was ever wasted, right?
Yeah.
Laura was really heartbroken because she knows how much this means to both of us. And she's like, Greg, is there a way you can fix it? So I did. I did fix it. I did put it together. And probably can't see, but there's a side here right above my finger that's cracked still.
Yes.
I love that because the broken chalice is holding the broken blood of body of Christ. I mean, the chalice will hold the body, but the body and blood of Christ broken is in a broken container.
Right.
So in a way, now here's the sad part, which can still be amended. I didn't know Kansugi when I did this. If I had known Kansugi, it would have been even, I think, more meaningful.
Well, it's not too late. I mean, you can do that now with our Kansugi set. But it is something to, So Kansugi master will repair, mend the fractures here with Japan lacquer, but then gold to highlight the brokenness.
Right.
And then this was done by a friend of mine who's a designer in her first Kansugi workshop, but she added the squiggle here just to have fun, and so the resulting Kansugi bowl is more valuable than the original, because first of all, in Japanese culture, when something breaks, they don't throw it away because they consider the brokenness to be sacred. So they keep the fragments, sometimes for several generations, and then they might give it to a Japan lacquer master, and he or she will mend it, apply gold, or create a new design. And this is a profound metaphor of the new creation that Christians should understand, that Christ's post-resurrection appearances includes his wounds and scars. Nail marks are still with him, And I was just talking about this All Angels Church in New York City. But it's remarkable that Jesus remained human. First of all,
Right.
like after all that he went through, he said, "I'm going to be human forever," which is remarkable. And it's even more remarkable that he is permanently a scarred human. And that says a lot about Christian theology, and Kansugi actually captures that the best.
I love what N.T. Wright wrote in the introduction to your book, Art and Faith, A Theology of Making. I'll just read a little bit. From broken teacups to broken lives and broken societies, mending is a part of making, and making reflects and embodies God's redemptive purposes. It's a brilliant introduction to a brilliant book, and I think it encapsulates, how you describe Kansugi. This is the first time I ever heard about it, was in the podcast with Mark, and how it connects with culture care, and then. I think you have many geniuses, but I would say your supreme genius is bringing together various forms and showing connections in places that are nexuses. But anyway, I'm going to go to that a little bit in a moment, but I'd love to just see if any other changes you want to ring about Kansugi and redemption as a Christian, and or the connection with past history of Japan. I love the story in your book about how Kansugi actually started.
Yeah, so I was born in Boston. My father is a research scientist, as you know, a pioneer in acoustics research, and he was doing his postdoc with Noam Chomsky.
Wow.
So I was born when he was doing his work. And then we went to Sweden for a couple of years, and then I ended up in Japan. I went to grade school in Japan. So my first culture, being my parents are both Japanese, so was Japanese. But then I'm like, I don't belong anywhere, and I came back to the U.S. as a middle schooler, and my English was very poor, and by the time I graduated from high school, I couldn't write in any language,
Right,
So it's actually astonishing to me that I wrote several books and people read them. It's really my upbringing, my father's pure science research, and my mother's as an educator. I was very much brought up in this world of integration, a world that sought, even though they had no religious concept of that. I was drawn to Christ because of the possibility of integration that divine love can bring, to understand, reading Dante, that there's a force behind everything, that love holds the universe together. And turns out it's in Bible, it's in Colossians as well, right? So that's how I began to understand the infinity of God's love, and it's through literature mostly. Wow. And yet I was brought up in very much in the forefront of scientific research. My father was at Bell Labs, Mirror Hill, the famed Pew Research facility, and so many of my friends are children of scientists and remarkable leaders themselves. And so I guess I was brought up in an environment in which this understanding of integration through technology was immediate to me. It was happening right in front of me, and so you might ask, so why did you become an artist? Well, I think it's connected. I think art and especially at that level, sciences are deeply connected. My father always said that and believed that, and he would sit in front of my paintings for 2 hours, and he would tell me what he was sensing, and So this was the my upbringing that allowed me to think that such integration was possible.
Right, right.
And I do believe that set me up for understanding of faith in a new way. And as I talk about in my book, it is about creation of something new, which is not new iPhone, but new newness, you
Right,
know.
right.
So those things come up, and I think about my parents all the time, you know, having lost both of them in the last 5 years. You know, there's some things that you don't discover until the person passes away.
Right,
and
right.
and you keep thinking back on the conversations, and it's actually very healing, because these conversations are enlarged, you know,
Right, right,
and in some way in your life,
right.
and so you want to try to honor that.
Well, my parents also died in 2015, and
Mm,
you know, I'm just relating to that at an emotional level. My dad was an engineer, and so I often will
mm,
say the way I got interested in science was from my dad. He loved to see how things worked, and he would
yeah,
show me how they work. So those
yeah,
Coke glasses that start small at the bottom and get big at the top, you know,
yeah.
those are the kind you have in the 1970s. And he said, you know, Greg, those are unstable glasses. He didn't like him as an engineer because they would tip over. The water was too high, right? You know, you might not have liked the chalice here. That's very
Yeah,
unstable
that's
too.
right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You know, so yeah, so I think about my parents a lot. I think about their
Yeah,
influence, and
yeah,
um,
yeah,
yeah, your father's work as a scientist sounds fascinating. And
yeah.
on the and it brought something up that is one of your themes. And I get back to science in a minute, but you talk in the book about this, and it's on your website too, this idea of boundary stalkers or boundary crossers. I think you also use on your
All the
IAM.
stalkers, yeah, messed
Yeah,
up. Yeah.
yeah, and that's from Beowulf or something, J.R.R.
Yes, that's
Tolkien's.
correct. Yeah, the Grendel's Mea Stapa, a Middle English word for border stalker. And a friend of mine, Bruce Herman, said, you know, artists are border stalkers, and you know, the world looks at us as if we're dragons about to destroy, and maybe we might, but but in order to understand an artist, you really have to understand the nature of people who are called to stalk the borders. And by the way, Jesus is one of those, and the Holy Spirit is another.
Right, right,
So,
exactly. Yeah.
so
Well,
we are dealing with, yeah.
I was gonna say, even at the beginning of the creation, you know, the ruach of
Yes,
God is brooding over the
yes,
waters. It's
that's
almost
correct.
like the borders haven't
God
even been
created.
created yet, you know. So the spirit's there looking and making sure that borders aren't
Yeah,
ultimate. That's
right.
almost
And we tend to think of ourselves at the center of things, but we are in the borderlands. I mean, the creation narrative is exactly that.
yeah,
God created something exuberant out of nothing that didn't need to exist.
yeah,
So there's also always an extra dimension to creation that we don't consider to be, you know, because we want to be at the center of it, right? And we want to argue for existence of God that way as well.
yeah,
We argue from our perspective.
right,
But that's not what Genesis is saying. Genesis is saying, no, God didn't need any of this. And yet God is love. And counterintuitively, this is how the world was made, from darkness. And light was the boundary. You know, and so God is not uncomfortable in darkness, because that's what God was. And the light and light and time are both elements that are, you know, gifts to us. And how remarkable, right? Then incarnate Son is born into that world, utterly dependent on that world.
right,
So this complete independence of God, the aseity of God, as you know, theology will have it, all sufficiency of God is flipped in the incarnation, and it is this gap, chasm that is as wide as, you know, infinity.
right,
And then all of a sudden we have a image of the incarnate Son, who's a babe in the manger, who is utterly dependent on all of these things that God didn't need, and yet, because of love, right? This is all something that needed to happen for our sake, but we don't consider any of that to be in the borderlands. We want it to be central, so that's why we defend the church as a central premise of culture. You know, if you are fighting culture wars, that's how we see ourselves. We're not in exile. You know, we are the Christian nation. You know, we're not going to let this slip away. But in fact, no, Christianity has always in the borderlands.
Mm-hmm.
It was always risk, faith, adventure, right, into the borderlands, and we are always in exile. We are aliens in strange lands, and so that perspective, the flip, is what I attempt to do in my book to start us off, and it leads to the tears of Christ because of the gap.
Well, and you talk about painting with the tears of Christ.
Yeah, yes.
That is so powerful. Yeah, because, well, there's actually three directions I want to go. So we'll go with the I want to get back to science, definitely in your experience with science. And I want to get to the border crossers in the sense of the alien identity, perhaps, that Philip Yancey talks about in his introduction to your book, which is Silence and Beauty, right? Isn't that what the title is? I might be getting okay. But I think one thing, Mako, that I don't want to miss is that you're really willing to continue to live into pain, and that's what Kansugi kind of exemplifies. It embodies. The piece behind me is our prized Mako, a Mako Fujimura piece, and you talked about 9/11. We were both in New York City during the terrorist attacks, and as I recall, as a response, you painted. Sorry, these are actually prints, I believe. You did prints of inspired by the quince trees at the Cloisters, which is the medieval art museum in New York City.
Yes.
And so there's this sense. I mean, this picture is only for this discussion in this room. Usually, it's in my bedroom. That's how close it is to me, and for Laura to have this ongoing memory of hope. Because trees are a sign of hope in the scripture. You know, blessed is the one who's planted, by this tree, like a tree, right? Like by the living waters. Mm-hmm. And yet also there's the sense of deep pain that it reminds me of. And, I think you said in the book that you do not want to make evil redemptive by itself, as far as I understand it. Like, that's not where you're going with this, but the naming of brokenness and the healing of brokenness, what still sees the brokenness, is powerful. So that's a lot of it. I don't know if it's a question there, but it's a reflection on how I respond to this theme of brokenness.
So the image behind you is called Shalom, and it was a painting, but it was done for lithography in Oneonta, New York, Tim Sheasley's studio. He's a master printer. And I was there in the summer prior to 9/11, and I did a whole bunch of test plates. And I was just painting trees and so forth, just to test because lithography, for those people, not knowledgeable about prints, is one of the hardest printmaking techniques. That's traditional techniques, and you make editions out of these. And the print behind you, I think there's only 50 prints of these. And they're done on very thin Japanese paper. But what happened was, on the eve of 9/12, we finally was able to get our car out from our ground zero parking lot before it shut down with gas leak, and we're very fortunate, and we drove up north and Tim at the time, I think he still does, has a studio for artists to stay in, artist families to stay in. So I thought about that the day of 9/11 because we had to evacuate and I didn't have a place to go. So I called Tim and said, hey, this would be a great time to, work on those prints, because I was supposed to go back. And so we drove 3 a.m. on September the 12th up north and arrived, and I couldn't sleep. And Tim is an early riser, so he was working in the studio around 5:30. So I just walked over, and he had printed the image behind you, about 10 of those out on the table, and he said, you didn't give me permission to print these, but I thought these were so beautiful. We should print them and we should make an edition. And I was like stunned looking at them, because they had just a very natural, because I wasn't performing to any kind of standard, so they came straight out of me, as it were. And then maybe it was the not having slept for a couple of days, but I heard something through my own images, which sometimes happens. Sometimes things, God can speak through things that you've made, but you didn't intend to. In this case, I didn't intend for this image to exist. So Tim's facilitation allowed for this experience, and I was looking at 50 of those, maybe 30 of those images. And Christ spoke to me this was like water. This was voice of Shalom speaking in a time of desperate anxious time, and it was literally a breath that I felt speaking through those images.
Wow. Well, I don't know that I knew the fullness of that story.
Yeah. And so what
it's
you
a little
said,
bit breathtaking. It is breathtaking as much as
Yeah.
you're talking about the breath. Like, to hear that is incredible.
Yeah. So it's great to see. Not many of those I know where they are. So it's great to see the image. I only have a few left. So
wow. Well, we treasure it, and I can tell you that it's framed really well, so you can see the paper. It's not pressed against the mat. It's you can see the delicacy of the paper.
Loaded. Yeah, and it should be that way. And it's really pushing the boundaries of technical boundaries of printmaking. And Tim is an amazing master. So he managed to capture that breath we were talking about, because it was so immediate. I hear the voice of Christ, voice of Shalom. This is despite what's happening, the still point, as Tia said, it will have still point of the turning world. For me, was represented in those pear trees, quince trees.
Wow. I'm a little bit speechless, but that's good. It just, I find that in reading your book too, Art and Faith, and other books you've written like Culture Care and so on, there's just these moments that I have in your writing where you do this boundary crossing and you show us what it means. Not like you're saying, hey, I'm doing boundary crossing, watch. It's more like you're bringing these things together. And I'll pull away. It's almost like it moves into a sort of Lectio Divina where I want to meditate on it a little bit, or more than a little bit, and just think, okay, I got something new here. So, if we could draw back to your father, he was really a prominent research scientist. Just doing a little bit of Wikipedia even on him and a few other articles. It's pretty amazing. So
he accidentally discovered CAT scan. So
oh my goodness, wow.
He was, as a young graduate student, he created the X-beam system so he can use attenuated X-ray to measure capture the voice vocal cords as a graduate student, and he carried on the work when he became full professor at Tokyo University, but he didn't patent it, and he intentionally didn't. He never patented his research because he believed that science should be open source. for progress to to take place. And so they developed CAT scan out of that research of attenuated X-beam machines.
Wow, that's amazing. But yes,
Yeah.
I mean, there's this connection. I think, obviously beauty is a part of art, though you well know that in 20th and 21st century art, beauty is actually a problem. Like Marcel Duchamp will say, we don't really want beauty anymore. We want ugliness or something, right?
Right.
So for a person who may not be in the world of art, or I teach a little bit of the humanities at Chico State, so I touch into art, and beauty may seem self-evident, but it's not always self-evident to artists. It is to you, but it's also, I think, profound how beauty connects with science. And I sent you this quote, but I want to read it just because it's so good, from Henri Poincaré, who was a scientist involved in 20th century quantum theory.
Yes.
He says that the scientist studies nature because the scientist takes pleasure in it. And he takes pleasure in it because it is beautiful. If it were not beautiful, it would not be worth knowing, and life would not be worth living. And he means in this the intricate beauty from the harmonious order of parts, and I think beauty in some ways is things fitting together well. There are other elements to it, but that's the angle I think often scientists will talk about it. We could talk about Einstein, we could talk about other people who brought in beauty into their science. And so I've often felt like this could be a real conversation point between scientists and artists.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the idea of beauty that people like Duchamp was reacting against was this Western, imperialist notion of cosmetic beauty and power. Right. And yet, artists of 20th century even began to discover that Japanese beauty or Eastern sense of beauty is different. Especially in Japan, beauty was refined to be something deeply connected with sacrifice and death. And so that's a different entry point for the materials I use have to be pulverized in order to be made beautiful, to be refractive. Kintsugi board is already broken, and that's the entry point into the new creation. And those things really connect to how we view the new as well. New not as just novelty or new iPhone, but new as something fundamentally new, newness, as I talk about in the book. And that if that is part of discovery and sciences as well as the arts. I was reminded this morning in our men's group, we were discussing generativity and how I forget how this came up. We were talking about Moses and we ended up here, but my father believed in the early 70s that the segmentalist data that they were amassing in order to reproduce human speech, it would never make human speech. Most of his colleagues disagreed. They mostly at Bell Labs in the early 70s, they believed that by 1985, they will have a machine that can speak perfectly, that you will not be able to tell that it's a machine. And my father said, no, the segmentalist data is the problem because language is always making itself new. And human capacity to understand this is what we have to deal with. If we want to talk about AI and if we want to talk about creating speech reproduction, and he was absolutely poo-pooed at the time, and he kind of had to go to Ohio State to finish his research because his theory was not accepted. It's called converted distributor theory, but it kind of pushed back against the normative understanding of language. It goes back to his research with Noam Chomsky. Language is generative. There's a universal principle that all people have to generate new language as we are learning language. And that difference between what we know to be static, maybe what we can study formulaically, and the reality of language that is being made is what human capacity to understand, the 80 billion neurons or whatever is in our brain, acting to intuit all of these things. That's why Alexa will always sound like a machine, because it doesn't yet have this capacity to create something new in response to what you are talking, as a human being.
Right. Wow. And there's a beauty to that, right?
There's a beauty to that. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a movement. And TSA and four quartets captures it perfectly. The time present and time past are perhaps contained in time future, right? So all this, he's intuiting out of his trauma of being an air warden and experiencing trauma, listening to Beethoven, and then recomposing everything that he articulated in the past, the wasteland, that is in front of him, and the decline of civilization, its imperialist beauty is disappearing, right? So what's going to remain? Well, to him, it was a reconciliation. The fire and the rose are one, right? And the mystics speaking about this highly intuitive process of rediscovering through our imagination the back door, rather than the analytical frontal. Mm-hmm. Something that is new about the fractures of our time. Even though if you might be facing the wasteland or the ground zero of your life, you can look into it, you can walk right into it and stand on the ashes and experience something new. And that promise is true of my father's research about trying to figure out what language does, as much as your work as a teacher, pastor, my work as an artist. It's all going to the same place.
Well, and obviously I could ask you questions and converse all day, but I know I want to make sure I get in at least one question about the church, and I think we moved in to that really well. And that is, what would be your message for the church? You've obviously talked about that in culture care. You do that in your in all the work you do publicly and through your website and through your collaborations. Right. They say that Bruce Herman is a friend of Laura's, and she says he's the greatest guy. Can only imagine this collaboration that we will hope to see someday that you've done. Yeah. So you've collaborated with people. You live it out. You have fellowship in that sense. You have a lot that happens for the ministry of the church at some level. So how do you bring this work of culture care into the church, and what are we missing right now in the church, and what is the hope you have for the way that we can bring culture care, the kind of beauty, the broken beauty of Kansugi, into the work of the church today?
Right. I think a lot recently about the connection between beauty and mercy and beauty and justice. I'm married to Heijin, who is an attorney, international advocate for the oppressed, and it occurred to me while writing this book that two things that the Darwinian universe really can't handle: beauty and mercy. We try. There are many books written by Darwinian, the recent times even, of beauty and Darwinian survival mechanism, but they don't really work. They rely on something other than the materialist closed universe to justify its transcendence. You say, well, the experience is transcendent, therefore it has to fit into the paradigm of Darwinian universe. But that's not a good, that's presupposition, flaw there. And mercy certainly doesn't make sense. Like, why would you care for a homeless during time of COVID?
Right.
Why, why would you vaccinate, the elderly? But we do it because it is an act of love. We do it because it is a human thing to do. Now, there are people like, Dr. Singer at Princeton who argue against that, right? I mean, it's very vocal about that. So we have to think about, so what is the church's position, right?
Yeah,
and
could I say,
how
put in one thought there, Mako? Sorry to interrupt, but just to say, I think in some ways, because I read that part in your book, and I've been really interested in this place of beauty in art and science, and I think we actually have to put beauty primary instead of secondary to reproduction, right? And Darwinian science says, well, it's all about reproducing, and and I think beauty is first. That would be an interesting shift. And when you talk about justice, when you talk about creation, when you talk about art, you're saying, well, maybe the beauty of God's creation of all people in the image of God is more important than whether I'm going to win or my clan's going to win in this struggle for existence. And I know Laura, my wife, does work with the homeless. That's her. That's what she leads in Chico, and she will always go back to God created us, and you could add as a master artist in the divine image. That is the basis of why we care. So it's almost like, if I may say, art comes before, beauty comes before, all these other things, which are very important, but we got to get them in the right order.
And God is not just the source of beauty. God is beauty.
Yes.
Right. So this is not an argument to be made, from theological perspective. Now Christians fall into this all the time. They defend, they defend God's existence, first of all, which is silly. God doesn't need for us to defend God's existence. God is pre-existing notion of existence. So that's not to prove or disprove. It is simply a reality. If we want to deal with the reality with a capital R, this is the assumption. Now it's an assumption, and you and my making it may not persuade anybody else to, but let's see if the pieces fit better. Why is the world so beautiful? Why is it beautiful despite the fact that nobody sees it? Why this cosmology which is embedded in each of our brains, 80 billion neurons working to create this intersection and overlaps and integration. Why? Why not just be fragmented? Why not everybody have all these weaponized, ways of survival? Why compassion and why love? Right. I mean, these are questions that sciences are not meant to answer, and best scientists know that. My father knew that, even though he was not a Christian. He knew that it came from the source of Occidental, reality of integration. And unless you have that transcendence built into the system, you end up with a really transactional science, and which by the way happened to elapse. So this is something that he understood to be fundamental as a scientist. So going back to beauty and mercy, these things don't make sense if we can accept that. So why is it important? Why is it fundamental? And I think those are, beauty and mercy are fundamental to the church. Everything else, right? We can, the world can do it better, probably. And we can certainly try to do it as a service to accommodate the utilitarian pragmatism of the world. But beauty and mercy are two things that don't make sense in order to just survive. So that's why it's essential. And because God is gratuitous, creation out of love, so I always say this: if we go out on a date, you don't do plumbing, You don't try to, just accounting. You go out and you watch a movie, listen to music, you watch fireworks, you watch sunsets. Those things don't make sense, right? In terms of survival. Like they are gratuitous, they are beautiful. They tend to, break down, pragmatic assumptions about the world. And yet, because we love somebody, we do things that don't make sense. That's what love does. Let's say God did that, right? In an amplified way, much more than we can. Then you have a picture of creation.
Right,
and we live in that creation, even though we rebelled against it because we wanted to control that, that variance or whatever. And we ended up, having been exiled from a place of protection. And now we're on our own, and we're fighting a Darwinian, battle, and we're fighting a culture wars. But then Jesus comes and says, no, look at the birds of the air, consider the lilies of the field. And we're like, what? That doesn't make sense. Nicodemus is saying, how can those things be true?
Yeah.
And that's the right question, right? To ask when we are encountering beauty and mercy. When we see somebody like Mother Teresa ministering to people who have no merit on their own, or you cannot, justify that existence in terms of sheer survival. She's endangering her life to help somebody who is in this perpetual loop of having no hope. Like, why would you do that?
Right.
That's where the Holy Spirit enters, that act of sacrifice, right? So again, it's connected to sacrifice. What I do to create beauty involves sacrifice. What my wife does to advocate for the poor in India, it requires sacrifice, enormous sacrifice. But that's where the Holy Spirit can enter, because we cannot justify it in a purely Darwinian materialist universe.
And the message out of that you're saying for the church is to enter into those places of beauty.
Right. So become makers again, and to provide mercy to the world that is so in need of people who are willing to sacrifice their own status and their own well-being in order to break the cycle. And when we are, even in a small way, right, when we stop to speak to somebody who that does not add to our resume, let's say, then the Holy Spirit kind of uses that moment in us, not just in the people that we might be speaking to. And that opens the door for transcendence and mystery to break into our lives, which is exactly what artists are trying to do with their work, right? So even an atheist artist creating something beautiful is breaking the cycle, and that's why Christians need to be there to support that artist, be with them in backstages of theater where they experience that transcendence. They come back to backstage and they weep because they can't explain it, and they know this is not something of them. And so we Christians have, we should be doing that. We should be culture carers and stewards of culture, helping the non-believing world who has lost hope to be able to hope again, because it is connected. What they experience is real. It's more real than we can realize in the Darwinian universe. That's why they hunger for it. That's why I want to create beauty, right? Because I long for that world. And that's why Hejin doesn't say justice is done until that person that she rescues sees herself beautiful.
Wow.
I mean, to her, that's the critical moment.
Right.
And that may take 20 years.
Right.
That's the reality of hope, is if somebody's willing to do that, that changes everything.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah. To see yourself as a person that's beautiful because that's true. And we know as true because God created us beautiful and we bear that beautiful image.
And how many of us, you know, when I hear stories of, you know, these girls who grew up in untouchable zones, and they're educated because we raise money for them to be educated in private schools and not in public schools, and then, you know, two girls just graduated from nursing home, their nursing school, and serving in nursing homes and the homeless. And you know, Rashni, one of the girls, says, you know, it wasn't until quite recently that I could see myself beautiful.
Mm.
And how many of us struggle with that, you know, to see ourselves beautiful?
Right.
And that shows the Western, you know, trappings that we always struggle to see ourselves in God's light and accept us as God sees us, as beautiful.
Right.
And we need to learn from Rashni, who went through that process, severely traumatized, and yet she can now minister in front lines of COVID because she is able to, you know, she knows herself. She can see herself as beautiful.